Hello and welcome to the Capitol Report on NTD Television. I'm your host, Steve Lance. Thank you for joining us. And here's a look at some of the stories we have coming up for you today. President Biden joined members of Congress on Capitol Hill today to mark the first-year anniversary of the January 6th Capitol breach. We look at how Congress members from both sides of the aisle are recognizing the events of the day. With all of the events and rhetoric surrounding January 6th, we had a chance to speak with former Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security, Ken Cuccinelli, to get some perspective on what happened that day and the significance of January 6th moving forward. And former President Donald Trump has issued a statement saying that President Biden's January 6th speech was divisive and a distraction from his failed policies. With President Biden's job approval polling at record lows and Democrats facing the prospects of a red wave in the upcoming 2022 midterms, we speak to a prominent lifelong liberal to find out where the Democrats may have gone wrong. Today, President Biden and Vice President Harris joined members of Congress on Capitol Hill to mark the first anniversary of the January 6th Capitol breach. Meanwhile, two Republican members held a press conference of their own to recount the events of that day. NTD's Melina Wisecup has more on today's events.
It's a big day on Capitol Hill as President Biden, lawmakers, and Vice President Harris mark the one-year anniversary of the January 6th Capitol breach. Biden giving his remarks right in the center of the Capitol building reflected on that day as an attack on democracy that will not be tolerated, noting that we're a nation of peace, not chaos. Here's some of his words from today.
I will stand in this breach. I will defend this nation. And I will allow no one to place a dagger at the throat of democracy. That authority in this nation will always be peacefully transferred. I believe the power of the presidency and the purpose is to unite this nation, not divide it, to lift us up, not tear us apart.
Preparing for the president's visit and just the sensitive nature of the day in general called for tighter security around the Capitol. When that chaos unfolded here just a year ago, around 140 officers were assaulted and some people tragically lost their lives. To honor and commemorate those lives lost, lawmakers this evening are holding a prayer vigil right out on the Capitol steps. And congressional leaders Pelosi and Schumer take it as their duty to preserve this day in history, and they hosted a moderated discussion with historians earlier this afternoon to do just that. Here's how they're hoping future generations will remember the events on January 6th.
A year ago, a mob of radicals carried out for the first time in over 200 years an armed attack on the U.S. Capitol in an effort to undermine our constitutional order. History is clear.
And it's also our duty to establish and preserve the narrative of that day. And that is what we are doing today.
It's why it can't just be about him. Remember that a more perfect union is about we the people, not about a single person.
And at the same time that Schumer and Pelosi were holding this discussion with historians, some Republican members of Congress, Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene and Congressman Matt Gaetz, held a discussion of their own recounting the events of the day. Let's hear some of their comments.
January 6th last year wasn't an insurrection. No one has been charged with insurrection. No one has been charged with treason. But it very well may have been a Fedsurrection.
Now, let's talk a little bit more about the FBI. They have quite a history of doing things. It would be in 1968 at the Democratic National Convention where there were 10,000 protesters and 1 out of 6 were federal undercover agents. Here at the Capitol security breach, we don't know how many federal informants, FBI agents of people in other agencies. We don't know those numbers.
So it's clear that there are different perspectives when it comes to reflecting on that day. And considering that this is the first anniversary of January 6th, it raises the question of how that day in history will be remembered and recounted in the years to come.
Now let's take a moment to commemorate some of the lives that were lost following the events that took place on January 6th. 35-year-old Ashley Babbitt, an Air Force veteran, was tragically shot by an officer. 34-year-old Roseanne Boylan from Georgia was caught in the middle of the chaos and died a day later. Kevin Greason, 55, and Benjamin Phillips, 50, both protesters who were outside of the Capitol, died from heart attacks. Capitol Police Officer Brian Sicknick had 2 strokes the following day and died shortly after. And 4 other officers died by suicide in the days and months following the riots. We send our thoughts and prayers to the families of all of these individuals on this solemn day. And here with us to discuss the events that took place on January 6th, we have former Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security, Ken Cuccinelli. Ken, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Good to be with you.
Ken, the Vice President in her speech at the Capitol today likened the January 6th Capitol breach to 9/11 and Pearl Harbor. What do you make of the Vice President's comments?
Look, it's part of the radical left over-the-top attempt to create a narrative where there isn't one. There were bad actors on January 6th. They've been prosecuted. Had that kind of vigor been put in place by prosecutors across the country in the 7 months running up to January 6th, I don't think anybody would have thought political violence was acceptable. But that same vice president was helping bail rioters out who were looting and doing harm and attacking police officers because of political viewpoints they held. And that was their excuse. And she backed them up at the time, as did the Speaker of the House, calling the very police officers who she on January 6th lauded as heroes, stormtroopers in all the days before that. I zero in more on the vice president's quote. Frankly, she said that democracy is built on the rule of law. What a great idea. Maybe we could try that at the southwest border, Mrs. Borders-Czar, and maybe we could have had a little more support from Congress and local prosecutors in the 7 months of rioting for political reasons that occurred all across this country by left of center, anti-American, violent criminals.
Ken, you were Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security when this took place, so I'm sure you have a deeper insight into the events than most people would. The mainstream media's narrative was that this was a deeply coordinated effort rather than a spontaneous event where people may have gotten caught up in the moment. There were also BLM activists who were there inciting the breach that were later charged as well. What is your take on all of this?
So we prepared for it as we do. Washington is obviously unique among cities because it's the capital city, and there's so many different law enforcement jurisdictions that overlap. The Capitol Police, responsible for the Capitol, the Washington Metro Police. You've got the Federal Protective Service, which most people hadn't heard of until the riots began last summer. 50-year-old organization that protects federal buildings other than the White House and other than the Capitol. And that falls under the Department of Homeland Security. So all of those have to work together along with others to manage the interactions between them. And as we prepared for January 6th, we used all of the usual open source efforts we normally undertake to figure out the scale of the event and the potential for problems. And while we saw no organization beforehand, much like the FBI has said after the fact, we did see the potential for problems. We saw the kind of rambunctious chatter beforehand and in volumes that we had seen in other cities where there was violence. And the Capitol Police had 100% access to all of that same information, and yet they were utterly unprepared. It had literally been years, and mind you, before I was at Homeland Security, I was Virginia's Attorney General, so I have some experience with state law enforcement as well. I have rarely seen such a failure of law enforcement leadership as I saw on January 6th by the Capitol Police. And it wasn't just one person. It was through a good chunk of the leadership of the organization and by the organization, the structure of the organization itself, which I only learned after the fact. But it had tragic results. And a lot of the officers there were really put in positions they should never have been put in. They didn't have the equipment they needed. They didn't have the numbers. They didn't have the backup in place, prepared. And their main backup is the Washington Metro Police, as it should be. And none of that was accessed effectively or utilized well.
Democrats today said that former President Trump actually wanted the attack to happen, and now you have Congress members on that January 6th subcommittee trying to hold people like Stephen Bannon and Mark Meadows in criminal contempt of Congress. What's your response to this effort to criminalize the former president and his supporters about the chaos that unfolded on that day?
You know, I interacted with the president pretty regularly, including in the before and after January 6th, and I never saw any indication of that on his part. There was no information that flowed through the Department of Homeland Security before or after that suggested that that narrative is accurate. The January 6th committee is really a witch hunt. It's really a political undertaking without a legitimate legislative purpose. And, you know, I think it'll also be viewed that way in history. And let's face it, the Democrats are creating quite an extraordinary precedent here in terms of the abuse of power by the legislature. And let me say this very clearly. If the Republicans don't utilize that same power to do the same kinds of investigations when they get into the majority next year, they will have failed us. Because the only way we will reach a civil equilibrium with respect to the use or abuse of legislative power is for them to suffer what they are inflicting on others right now. And I wish that weren't true. There'll be plenty of people who say, oh no, we're the nice guys and we're going to be the nice guys now. History doesn't suggest that works. And in the interest of long-term peaceful legislative existence, I think that is going to happen in the next Republican House.
Ken Cuccinelli, thank you for joining us.
Good to be with you.
Former President Trump said that President Biden's criticisms of him on the anniversary of January 6th were divisive.
He has done what no president in American history, the history of this country, has ever done. He refused to accept the results of an election and the will of the American people.
Former President Trump reiterated his claims that the 2020 elections were rigged. He said the Select Committee investigating January 6th want all conversations concerning the election canceled. Trump also said that Biden was trying to distract from his failed policies. He said in a statement, Biden is working hard to deflect the incompetent job he is doing and has done on the horrible Afghanistan withdrawal, the borders, COVID, inflation, loss of energy independence, and much more. Batya Ungar-Sargon is the deputy opinion editor for Newsweek, and from what she told us, she was a hardline liberal for most of her life, but she has recently had a change of heart. Here's part of our interview. Batya, thank you so much for joining us on the Capitol Report.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, I don't know how you would describe yourself. Feel free to, set the record straight, but you were a former Democrat. Where do you think that the Democrats have gone wrong in their messaging?
So I would call myself a left-wing populist, sometimes socialist, depending on how you define that. I would say I'm a socialist in the way that I think President Trump was. He pursued a lot of economic policies that Senator Bernie Sanders was advocating for as recently as 2015. So I'm very much on board with all of that. And that's what the problem, I think, is with the Democrats today is they've really abandoned their erstwhile advocacy on behalf of labor and the working class, and they see their base increasingly as the college educated and the very highly educated. And so you'll see their platform has morphed to really reflect that. So a lot of the open borders policies, essentially. Who benefits from open borders and who pays the price for it? The working class pays the price for it because you suddenly have an underclass willing to work for less than minimum wage. And who benefits from it is the people who want to employ people for less than minimum wage as domestic servants in their homes, or people who want a really nice $15 bottle of wine who don't want to pay for an American to have picked those grapes. And so that the shift on immigration that you've seen among the Democrats over the last 10, 20 years really reflects their shift in who their focus is. There are other things. You'll see people who call themselves progressives advocating for $50,000 in student loan forgiveness. ask yourself, who has $50,000 in student loans, right? It's accountants and dentists and doctors and nurse practitioners, people who are making really good money. And who's going to be paying off those student loans? Who's going to be paying the taxes on that? I mean, those people, but also the 90% of Americans who are not in the elites, the people who are working class. And so instead of representing welders and linemen and factory workers today, the Democrats are the party asking those people to pay off the student loans of dentists and accountants. I'll just give you one more example. I think with COVID, you really saw the liberals and the Democrats abandoning the essential workers the minute they could. So we were all happy to stand outside and cheer for them when we, the elites, were at home working in our pajamas, clacking away on our keyboards, relying on the labor of working class Americans who went into the pandemic, went into the belly of the beast, into danger, put their lives on line every single day. And then the minute we had a vaccine, suddenly the liberals stopped cheering for those people and started denouncing the people who didn't want the vaccine. Those very same first responders and grocery workers, nurses, cops, people who just maybe don't want the vaccine because they know how to keep themselves from getting and spreading COVID, because they spent the most dangerous time learning how not to get and spread COVID.
Wow, so many things to unpack there, really. It sounds to me like you're saying that there were a lot of contradictory things that you've seen throughout, the course of time. What would you say was your aha moment, if you will?
I remember learning about the deaths of despair in rural America, primarily targeting people without a college degree, men without a college degree, who are increasingly dying of opioid overdoses or suicide. And I remember thinking, these are the people that my class, the highly educated lefty liberals who are on the news every night, have the most contempt for. They go on the news every night and call them racist because they voted for Trump, right?
Got you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
And coming up, the country is seeing a record number of CCP virus pediatric hospital admissions. Almost 1,000 children were hospitalized on Wednesday. And North Korea has fired yet another hypersonic missile into the Sea of Japan. We take a look at what this might mean for the U.S. and its allies moving forward. A second snowstorm is on the way to the D.C. area, arriving Thursday night. Dangerous road conditions are expected throughout much of the region on Friday. Hello and welcome back to NTD's Capitol Report. As of Wednesday, the U.S. is seeing a record number of CCP virus pediatric hospital admissions. Almost 1,000 children were hospitalized with confirmed infection. It's the highest number throughout the pandemic. Federal data shows that 951 children with the CCP virus were admitted to hospitals on Wednesday. New pediatric admissions started to skyrocket from last week, but President Biden said that schools should remain open. Hospitalizations are also rising among adults. Nearly 115,000 Americans with the CCP virus are currently hospitalized. Defending champions Alexa Nurum and Brandon Frazier withdrew from the U.S. Figure Skating Championships after Frazier tested positive for the CCP virus. The pairs event begins today at what amounts to the U.S. trials for the Beijing Olympic team. Frazier needs to isolate throughout the weekend. Both Frazier and Nurum are vaccinated and have received boosters. The Deputy Postmaster General is asking the government for a temporary delay from the COVID-19 vaccine mandate for U.S. Postal Service employees. The mandate requires USPS workers to either be vaccinated or get weekly testing. Deputy Postmaster General Doug Tolino sent a letter to the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. In the letter, he wrote that the mandate will likely cause many postal employees to quit or be fired. Tolino suggests that with the current supply chain and staffing challenges, the U.S. cannot afford more potential setbacks to our mail delivery systems. He is requesting a 120-day extension of the deadlines to comply with the mandate. North Korea acknowledged its latest missile launch early on Thursday. a day after South Korean authorities first reported it. The U.S. State Department condemned the launch. The United States condemned North Korea's ballistic missile launch on Wednesday, saying it violated multiple UN Security Council resolutions and posted a threat to Pyongyang's neighbors. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin are set to meet virtually with their Japanese counterparts today for regular security talks. Pyongyang state media called the launch a hypersonic missile and said that it traveled 435 miles to hit its target, including a 75-mile lateral movement. The launch came shortly after North Korean leader Kim Jong-un vowed to further strengthen his military capability. Here to discuss the recent missile launch by Pyongyang, we have Grant Newsham, a retired Marine officer and now with One Korea Network and also a senior fellow at the Center for Security Policy. Grant Newsham, thank you so much for joining us on the Capitol Report.
No, pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
Now, Grant, on Thursday, North Korea said it successfully tested a second hypersonic missile off the East Coast, causing major concerns for Japan and South Korea. This is advanced weaponry that can fly 5 times faster than the speed of sound. For starters, can you explain the threat posed by this type of technology and how far along it is that North Korea is in producing these types of weapons?
Well, the technology is it's a threat. Make no mistake, it's been known that the Chinese in particular have been working on it for well over a decade, and that they've had things that work. But what it does is, if you think of it, say you're shooting at a clay pigeon with a shotgun, and suppose the pigeon suddenly goes 5 times faster than you're expecting it, and then suppose that it suddenly drifts, goes to the left, to the right, up, down, it's able to maneuver. That makes it a very much harder thing to shoot. And current anti-missile defense systems are geared towards that slower pigeon that doesn't change his direction. So that's sort of how a layman might understand it. It is a huge problem from a defensive perspective because it's very hard to track, to follow, to hit. And you'll see I mentioned Chinese inadvertently because the North Koreans couldn't develop this without Chinese assistance. But the North Korean missile and nuclear programs have undergone a steady upward improvement in capabilities in terms of missiles, so that the missiles can go farther and can hit what they aim at more accurately. So eventually they're going to get the range, and Washington, D.C. is going to be in range, and they'll have the accuracy down to where they can hit what they aim at. But the hypersonic part of it, as I said, that just makes it a very much harder thing to stop. The best solution to it is to have your own capabilities and to make it clear that anyone that uses one, that they'll get 100 in return.
Now, Grant, on the issue of China, North Korea's major ally, Communist China, North Korea is certainly creating tensions before the Beijing Olympics. China has called for dialogue. What do you think will happen next?
The Olympics will be held, and once that's done, we're going to see what we've seen for the last 20 years, which will be the North Koreans improving their technologies, their capabilities, conducting launches, constantly sort of spewing out venom verbally. But the missiles and nuclear tests, those will continue. And North Korea, it's playing the same old game. It's trying to get concessions. And there will be pressure put on the United States to talk, to just negotiate, to accept North Korea as it is. The Chinese will put that pressure on. The South Korean leftist administrations will as well. And even within the U.S., there will be a push to have the Americans just talk, to so-called give peace a chance. But it'll be the same old game that we've seen for a long time. I've been following the North Korean business for 30 years, and absolutely nothing has surprised me. It is as predictable as the sun coming up in the east every morning.
Now, Grant, looking back at former President Trump's relationship with North Korea, it started out very rocky, with Trump blatantly stating that the U.S. military could easily destroy North Korea with fire and fury that the world has never seen before. But later, Trump and Kim held an unprecedented summit between the two nations. They seem to have developed a bit of a rapport. Was there ever a possibility of peaceful relations with North Korea under the Trump administration? And what should we expect to see under the Biden administration?
Well, I think you could have seen some potential improvement during the Trump administration, but ironically, it would have happened while Mr. Trump was threatening fire and brimstone against the North Koreans. The so-called maximum pressure campaign that the Trump administration applied was showing some results, and also they were wisely emphasizing the absolute human rights abomination that is the North Korean regime. And that was actually working. So when I say North China put the screws on them, you'll recall that before Kim met with Mr. Trump, that he had a meeting with the Chinese at their demand, and they apparently read the Riot Act to him and said, "You'd better not cut any deals with the Americans." And at that point, there was really very little chance of things improving. But it was that maximum pressure campaign, both sanctions and the credible threat of military force, if necessary, that was putting sort of the screws on North Korea for the first time ever. There's been sanctions on North Korea for a long time to a degree, but they've never really been enforced. But the Americans this time were serious, and they were giving some other countries the choice of doing business with North Korea or with doing business with the Americans. And it could have worked because it is that access to foreign currency, to luxury goods, and to some raw materials, and oil in particular, that really keeps the North Korean regime afloat. Without that, it wouldn't last for a week.
Grant Newsham, thank you.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you very much.
10 days before inauguration, Virginia Governor-elect Glenn Youngkin has tapped the Trump administration's EPA chief to join his cabinet, overseeing the state's environmental policy. Andrew Wheeler is Youngkin's pick for Secretary of Natural Resources, the transition team announced on Wednesday. This has drawn immediate criticism from some Democrats and environmental groups who accused Wheeler of downplaying the threats of climate change. During Wheeler's term heading the EPA, the Trump administration took a sweeping change on Obama-era policies by easing restrictions on coal-fired power plants. Youngkin has also chosen Michael Rolbend, the founder of a natural and historic resources consulting firm, to lead the Department of Environmental Quality. The D.C. area will wake up to another blanket of snow covering the region on Friday morning. A storm of 2 to 4 inches of snow is on the way, arriving Thursday night. The heaviest snowfall is expected between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m., with lighter snow coming down in the early morning hours. Frigid temperatures may create ice-making road conditions hazardous for morning drivers. Friday commuters may face challenges and should prepare accordingly. And that's all we have for you on today's Capitol Report. Thank you for joining us on NTD Television. I'm Steve Lance, and we'll see you tomorrow.